Folks, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi. This is a fun passage. My guess is that even if your Bible knowledge is pretty low, there was a section in that middle part that you recognized. This one right here, seem a little familiar? You've probably seen it on a football sign, somebody waving it from the stands, or on the street corner. John 3:16 got some really good marketing there for a while. A lot of people, if you ask them what the Bible's main message is, they're going to tell you that this is the gospel in a nutshell. And since it contains a very simple formula, believe, gain eternal life, it's kind of appealing. Can't get much more simple than that, right? But of course, we're rushing past some big questions to get to this formula. There's questions about what belief is and what is part of Jesus's work, what's everlasting life, and go on. So I'd actually like to take that whole passage. I actually think we kind of have to look at the whole thing. And in so doing, I'd like to actually be a little vulnerable with you all this morning and just share a little bit about my life. And I hope that that's going to be okay, because I hope that even as I'm sharing my story with you, that maybe you can find some places of your own story to plug in. Because one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had reading the Bible was reading this passage. And I'm going to want to tell you a little bit about that. But in order to explain my connection to this and what I'd like to share with you all this morning is I have to share about why I have a fraught relationship with the sun. That was supposed to be the sun. There's the sun. You might notice that I'm a redhead. Shocker. Well, I'm not as red as I used to be, and I'm a little less to work with as far as like being able to tell, but trust me, it's still there. I still have my membership card. And as a child, I was, believe it or not, even more melatonin challenged, shall we say, than I am now. And so you know that feeling when you first go outside and you let the rays of sun hit you and it kind of feels good and relaxing. And for me, that lasts about 10 seconds before I start to look for cover. I have a love-hate relationship with the sun, perhaps more on the hate side, if I'm being honest. You should have seen me at the beach. Other kids are splashing around in the waves and running around freely. Me, you'd find me under the umbrella, wearing a shirt and hat, usually with a little towel over my head on top of all that, and another one over my legs and my feet. If I dared to emerge from my cocoon, of course the shirt stayed on, and then you'd see a layer of sunscreen on my face and arms so thick that you could stick a toothpick onto my arm and it would stand straight up. I treated going to the beach like I was going to ground zero of a nuclear accident or something. And honestly, it's not all that different these days. My wife loves this. I just have better equipment now. I have the sun shirt, and the beach tent, So I'm still a little afraid of the sun. But for most of my time growing up, I was afraid of the sun, but also afraid of being seen. I didn't want any of my skin to be exposed to the searing rays of the sun, and I also didn't want my tender heart and mind to be exposed to the cruel taunts of other children, or to a military-minded father who had very specific ideas of how boys were supposed to behave and think and deal with their problems. As an Air Force brat, I moved around every 3 years or so. In elementary school in Germany, I was bullied pretty regularly for being different. And so when I found out I was moving back to the States, I made a decision. I resolved I wasn't going to let that happen again. It was too hard. I was going to do whatever it took to act like the other kids. I was going to talk like them. I was going to think like them. I was going to very consciously going to become them, and then they couldn't do anything. So I get to super deep South Florida. We used to call it the Floribama, Sunshine State. I was super shy, but eventually I made a popular friend, and then I put my plan into action, and it worked for a little while. I developed an accent. I wore polo shirts tucked into my jeans. I even dared to try to go to the beach a few times. And at times, I was cruel to other kids who were also different, which never felt right, but it felt a whole lot better than being the target of some of those taunts again. But eventually the cracks started to show. I couldn't keep it up forever. And some of the kids started to realize I was pretending. Some kids started targeting me, and before I knew it, the bullying and the taunting was worse than ever. My depression got worse and worse, my home life got worse and worse, and it was all I could do to just turtle down and be afraid of every ray of sunlight and convinced that I would be alone, and all those fun thoughts. So, yeah, I'm wondering where you might see yourself in all of this. I know all of our stories are different, but many of you have probably stories of dealing with painful times in childhood as well. Maybe all of us can think of times as children or as adults that we've been afraid of being seen, afraid of being seen for who we really are, ashamed of our past mistakes, maybe convinced that our failures will always follow us around, even hide from ourselves, that we see the world as cruel and judgmental, and we're too afraid to let the sunlight in. Some, like me, hide and pretend because we actually don't have a good sense of who we are in the first place. We don't feel rooted or connected anywhere, and so if you don't feel safe anywhere, it's hard to do that. When we don't easily fit within categories of acceptable behavior or ways of thinking or feeling, so we fake it until we make it, as they say. Those who grow up with questions about sexuality, gender identity, especially if they receive negative messages about that or feel threatened about having those questions early on, they may well know the feeling of needing to hide who they are out of fear of judgment or ridicule or attack. If we're being honest, we all have ways in which we make masks. We make masks that are so convincing that we ourselves can even pretend that they're real. Social media now allows us to project whatever version of the self we want out there, and it gets validated with likes and comments. Yeah, hey, this is me. It also bombards teens and young adults with standards of perfection that they will always fall short of. And there's all these consequences to all these ways in which we hide, all the ways in which we self-protect: depression and anxiety, anxious attachments and avoidance, and seeking out belonging, connection among bad actors, vulnerability to adopting hate speech and violent rhetoric. We see this playing out in our country right now. But all of us at some point and in some way hide in plain sight. There are times when we feel the need that turtle in, that need to avoid the sun at all costs. Because if we become masters of blending in, then we can avoid the pain of judgment, the pain of being hurt. We all fall victim to this false belief that we're supposed to deal with the things on our own. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about the sun. As much as I don't want to admit it, we need it. It's the very thing that causes pain, is also the very thing that provides energy for all life. It illuminates our days and our nights through the moon. Try as I might, I cannot entirely avoid it, nor should I. The sun's good for me, in doses and with plenty of SPF, 50 on hand. So I moved again, and I managed to find community and youth group and sports. I had friends finally communicate to me that message that I needed to hear, which was, you don't have to pretend to be something you're not. You can just be yourself. I found lifelong friends who challenged me in college to look deeper into my faith as more than some verse on a sign or a formula that I can follow. And one day I was actually working in the library, and I actually started looking at this verse. I think I had a study Bible of some sort, and I started noticing something that I hadn't noticed before. That's Jesus. Those who believe in him are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already. You see that word condemn, but it's actually the same word as judgment. I know the version we read was a little different, but in some translations it says judgment or verdict, but it's the same word, and you wouldn't see that in English, but it's actually in Greek the same word. It's the same root. We think of judgment as this negative thing in our culture, right? We don't want to be judgy. But in a legal sense, we're okay with it because we want fair judgments. We want to make things right. Here we're talking about the hands of God, so maybe a good judge. In verse 17, we look at it again. It's God sent the Son into the world not to condemn, not to judge. He's kind of saying that the goal right there isn't to judge in the sense of condemn the world in itself. The goal is to save, to make things right. Verse 16, so love the world. That's what's motivating Jesus' mission, to love the world. So what's the judgment? It's back up here, 19. Judgment is light that came into the world. And what is judgment at its best than that uncovering of truth? The seeing what is real, like light, so that things can be made right. So this is what I begin to wonder is, what if God's judgment, what if God's judgment and God's love are actually related for John? That light is actually a metaphor for both. Because light comes into the world, it exposes us. If you've been in a dark place for a long time, you know that feeling, like in Plato's cave, where you've been in a dark place for a long time, and then all of a sudden you come into a bright spot. What is it going to do? It's going to burn your eyes, right? It might even be so bad that you might be tempted to run back into the dark place. It's easier. If you've ever felt deep shame, you know that sometimes that initial feeling of being seen and being exposed, which is necessary for someone to accept who you are, right? That feeling can actually sting a little. And in fact, for some, they'll do anything and everything in their power to avoid exposure. I think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. If you're familiar, there was a process of amnesty where if people would own up to their crimes and share the stories of the things that they committed, they could actually apply for amnesty. And so many people refused. I remember reading Desmond Tutu's book and marveling at how many people were actually refused amnesty. They would rather face retribution and judgment and punishment than be exposed. Not just to say what you do, but to be vulnerable about it. To admit that you're wrong. That verse 21 again, the opposite of those who do what evil is not, those who do what is evil, the opposite of that is those who do what is true. Isn't that really interesting? It's not those who do good, it's those who do what is true. They're related, obviously, but the idea is the ones who are coming in the light. I remember the feeling reading this the first time, that sense of relief that I'm living a life of faith. It wasn't about getting the formula right. It wasn't about believing the right things or about doing the right things or even progressively becoming a better person. It was about that starting point of seeking to live authentically, to be in the light, to take the masks off, to set aside that exhausting work of maintaining others and God's perceptions of me. To embrace the Son without fear, to relish in love itself. Of course, it's been an ongoing journey, right? I didn't suddenly become like the most authentic person in the world, if there is such a thing. I don't think there is. Living authentically, accepting ourselves for who we are is not easy work. It's actually lifelong work, if we're honest. As we get older, it gets harder because we actually start to set those kinds of personal projects aside as we have all the things that we're dealing with between work and family, and we just get busy, right? So we set aside that personal work sometimes. But we know we need it. We know we need it when someone offers us kind words and there's a part of us that says, no. I know, some of us, that might resonate. Even as we're like craving it at the same time, we're like, oh, thank you, but no. Or sometimes there's guilt or frustration or anger or shame that kind of bubbles up in our lives and we don't know where it came from. It got triggered somehow and we don't know where it came from and we need to deal with that. It might be a sign that we need to let some light in. Authenticity doesn't mean that we need to start broadcasting our dirty laundry to the world. But we all need places and people with whom we can be vulnerable and where we can be accepting of their love and vice versa. To remind us that we can't hide our true selves from God, to accept this to embrace the sun, instead of seeking to be perfect or to try to live up to some sort of standard. That's how it was for me, finding that community in college. And it like incarnated God for me in that way. So God's dream for the world to make things right, to enact justice, starts with people who love, who forgive as they've been forgiven, and who live with less fear because they know that they have nothing to fear. Like the moon, we reflect the sun. To do this, we have to be a little less afraid of the sun. Find ways to let the light in. You might need some sunscreen, maybe, I don't know. But at least we ourselves need loving spaces. We need loving people who will accept us as we are and tell us the truth about ourselves, because we need to hear it, the positive and the rest. We need to create those kinds of spaces to be that kind of space for each other here and wherever else we gather. That's what our O&A covenant's all about, after all, right? Creating a safe and brave space. And that's what we're going to renew this morning as part of our, it was 2 years ago that this church became open and affirming officially. So we want to become that kind of space. It requires that. And encountering sunlight, especially during the Lenten season, we can learn to not be so afraid, or rather to give up our needs to impress or to set aside our drives to succeed or needs to be perfect or pretend that we're not all wounded beggars looking at other beggars trying to find bread. And there's a great beauty in that acceptance of ourselves and of each other. So what I've found in my own life is as I've become more accepting of myself, it actually helps me be more accepting of others at the same time. It's living in the light, being ourselves, not being afraid. So just a question this morning is, where do we need that light? Just want to leave you with that question. Where do we need God's light in our own lives? What is a way or maybe a person or a place where we can maybe let a little more sunlight in? These pictures up here during Lent were meant to represent ways in which our youth and others who have contributed art, ways to let the light in for their own lives, ways of opening up space for themselves. It's a great notion of how to understand what we're doing during Lent. So I invite you to ask yourself that question this morning. Where do you need some light? Where do you need to open yourselves up? And as I ask that question, I'm going to close us with a poem that many of you probably know. Mary Oliver's Wild Geese, which only vaguely references the sun, but the ideas here are very much in line with what we're talking about. And invite you to receive this in a spirit of prayer and a gift of grace from God. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. In the name of Christ, amen.